everyone to our January 19th, 2021 Zoom event featuring Roberto Mendoza. Our organization, the Indigenous Institute of the Americas, is a nonprofit American Indian group located in Plano, Texas. Our council, circle of advisors, elders, youth, and ambassadors come from all across the world. I would like to introduce those attending that represent our organization. When you hear your name or your contribution to our organization, would you please wave your hand? First, I would like to introduce Gregory Gomez, the co-founder of our organization and president of IIA. Greg, good wave, thank you. Our other co-founders are Dr. Kathy Gutierrez Gomez, who is also one of our advisors. I don't know if she's in the room. And Eddie Sandoval, who is one of our Apache leaders in the Fort Worth area. Our council includes Vice President Tanya Bond, who's Navajo and Zuni. Yay, Tanya. Our treasurer, Constance Hargis, who's Choctaw and Cherokee, who I don't think she's on tonight. And myself, Chickasaw and Cherokee. I'm secretary of the organization. If Dr. Gonzalez is anywhere around, and I don't see her at the moment, Dr. Gonzalez, Patricia Gonzalez, and I are the co-founders of IIA's Seed Ambassador Program and Indigenous Grocery Store Program. We also have very special guests tonight, our ambassadors and our advisors, Lelia. She's in Paris right now, correct? Yes, we're so glad to have you. And we're hoping that Natalia, I don't know if Natalia is here or not, but she will be, I guess, in Spain. Is that correct, Gregory?
Southern France.
Oh, Southern France, okay. Our circle of advisors, elders, youth, and volunteers who have helped us with Santa Fe Days and all of our other IIA initiatives, go ahead and give a big wave so we can thank you for your hard work. Let's see some hands there. Yay! All right, great to have you. Last, I would like to thank a group by the name of Cooperation Plano. If you could wave Noah. So Noah and his group helped us connect with Roberto, and we hope to build an ongoing friendship in the future as they're wonderful advocates and allies supporting many of the issues that are affecting us in our Native community. We want to thank everyone for joining us tonight. This program is an extension of our Ask Uncle Gregory series. If you haven't already seen some of these videos, please enjoy them on our YouTube channel at iiamericas.org. The Ask Uncle Gregory program preserves traditional knowledge of elders through video and audio files. We believe that the traditional knowledge of our ancestors can help us have perspectives on the world we live in today. And we believe it is time to collect, archive, and share our cultural information, especially for our Native youth. Although we started this program over 6 years ago, we realized through the pandemic that much of our tribal and family knowledge could be lost with this generation. I would like to now ask Gregory Gomez, an Apache, Marine, Vietnam veteran, father, grandfather, and our president to lead us in an opening prayer and blessing.
Oh, Sanego Chitinde Saina Estimpa. I come before you, Great Spirit, asking you in humility to be with Roberto and the rest of the group that is present and those that may join us today and in the future. I want to thank you for every step of life that I have been able to take, for all that I have seen, for every breath, every beat of my heart. I want to thank you for my parents and grandparents who took the time to role model, answer questions, and guide me. I want to thank you for my family. I want to help you for the transition that is taking place, that I may do whatever it is that needs to be done from my corner, my section of the world. I hope. Amen.
Thank you, Gregory. We all appreciate you offering that prayer. Just some housekeeping reminders during Mr. Mendoza's presentation. We will ask everyone to mute their microphones, and when he's finished, then we'll have a discussion. I'll try as a moderator to look for everybody's hands waving to let me know that they want to open their mic and ask a question. Please try to give as many people as possible a chance to ask questions and interact. And let us allow Mr. Mendoza to address what he feels is important to share of those questions. I would like to now tell you about our guest speaker, Mr. Roberto, I'm trying to do it, Mendoza. He was teasing me about how I pronounce his name, is a citizen of the Muscogee Nation of Oklahoma. Mr. Mendoza has a very rich history of helping in the Native community since his early years. He was born in Oklahoma in 1943 and attended Haskell Indian School for a short time. I mention that because many of the people in our audience also attended Haskell School. He then went to University of Missouri, where he joined the Students for a Democratic Society. He was always seemed to be interested in artistic talents such as drawing, filmmaking, and writing. He moved to San Francisco as a young man. He wanted to become a beat writer in the 1960s. And for you young people who are on tonight, I want you to Google this time period because it was very much connected with our Native and Chicano literature. While in California, he enlisted in the Navy and also became a member of the American Indian movement. Mr. Mendoza was in the San Francisco Bay Area in the 1960s. And as you know, this was a very dynamic time and place for our culture. He took part in a living history. He was involved in that takeover of Alcatraz, that's what I call it, and the struggles of the Pitt River tribe of Northern California. He served in 1972 as the co-chair for the San Francisco American Indian Movement Organization. And then after getting married, moved to a reservation in Maine and continued his work in that area. In the 1980s, Mr. Mendoza was on the front lines of the Green Movement and bioregional movements, and after moving back to Oklahoma, became a founder of Green Corn Symbiosis and now works with Cooperation Tulsa. Mr. Mendoza went to Standing Rock and brought back a view of that experience through his writings. If you want more information for me to connect you after this is over, please let me know. He organized Idle No More Central Oklahoma and the 2016 Global Day of Solidarity with Standing Rock in Oklahoma City. He is the recipient of the 2016 Oklahoma Human Rights Award because of his passionate support of human rights, especially those of the American Indian and Indigenous communities. Mr. Mendoza is the author of a book. He is a writer and director of the film The Eagle and the Condor. He has been a speaker at many academic institutions, and he is referenced in many books. When I was looking up more information about him, it was Roberto Mendoza, Muscogee Creek Nation. So he is looked upon for advice and knowledge, especially because of his feminist and humanistic values. He is obviously a man of high energy with an ability to take that energy and put it into constructive action. I'm so honored to now hand over the Zoom session to Mr. Roberto Mendoza from Tulsa, Oklahoma.
Oh,
Thank you. Can you hear me okay? All right, I want to say a little bit about the title of this seminar, Answering Dr. King's Call for Radical Revolutionary Values. Well, about 10 years ago, I was reading Dr. King's speech, Beyond Vietnam, and I came across a quote of his. He said, "We as a nation must undergo a radical," and that really struck me because it got to the heart of the problem of this country is our value system. So that's why I had to come up with some values that maybe he could have come up with also if he had lived, but unfortunately he was assassinated a year later. So that's where the title came from. And we would like to make an acknowledgement of the land. In Plano, it's Wichita and affiliated tribes. And in Tulsa, it's the Muscogee Nation, the Cherokee Nation, and the Osage Nation. All are part of Tulsa. And now Muscogee Nation is a reservation, finally, after many years of being denied that. And the biography pretty much speaks for itself. The group Cooperation Tulsa was originally called Green Corn Symbiosis because I was joining the Symbiosis International Network, which is a group that has similar values. And a lot of the groups in that network are called Cooperation, like Cooperation Plano, Cooperation Jackson, Cooperation Denton. So we decided to change our name to Cooperation Tulsa, and that's what it is now. Can you slide?
Yeah. Hi, everyone. My name is Holly Wall-Dallenberg, and I helped on this PowerPoint with Roberto, and I am a member of the Cherokee Nation. I just moved back to Tulsa after 10 years in Colorado and Minnesota. And so I was able to get some education and went to Fort Lewis, which is an Indigenous school, which was a really great experience. And then I just graduated with a master's in entomology. So I study honeybees and social insects, but have some experience with Indigenous values from different Ojibwe and Anishinaabe elders from that area. So thanks for having me here.
Yes, thank you for helping us create this slideshow. And here is the larger statement. He said, I am convinced that if we are to get on the right side of the world revolution, we as a nation must undergo a radical revolution of values. And that's the most radical way you can look at what has to happen. And the word radical actually just means going to the root. And that's what he did. So a lot of times radical is, when you're called a radical, that means you're extremist. But really it just means that you're going to the root of the problems. And what I saw was that we have a problem with our values. And one of the other things that I saw from this writer, these two writers, Michael Hart and Antonio Negri, a book called The Multitude. And it inspired me to think that, we need to expand our conception of who can make this revolution. And then what he was saying is that we have to move beyond the old Marxist-Leninist style of thinking that the workers are the only people that are going to make a revolution. And we have to think that everybody is needed for this new change that we're trying to create. And that includes people from the middle and the upper class, because a lot of times leftist groups will exclude them and see them as the enemy. And I also have another group that I'm a part of that really emphasizes that upper class people can also become a part of this revolution of values, because we're not talking about violent revolution. We're just talking right now, changing our values. And another place that I got inspiration is the people in South America who came up with the concept of buen vivir, or living well. Inti, your people probably are part of that. And basically they're saying, we're working to live and not living to work. We place life first with institutions at the service of life, living within our means sustainably and in harmony with other nations and the natural world. And this requires cooperation, respect for the earth, balance, sharing, not individualism, competition, and materialism, which are capitalist values. And this is all the different ways that we can reach this goal is through practicing direct democracy, developing popular education, using general strikes, marches and rallies, mutual aid projects, and food sovereignty. So I started realizing that people unconsciously have capitalist values in their thinking, and they act on them because they're not conscious of them. And one of the greatest values of capitalism is individualism, and that is seen as such as a extreme value that a lot of people practice it, especially people who are following Trump, when they say, I don't need to wear a mask because that's taking away my freedom. So that extreme individualism ignores the fact that they're living among people and they could harm other people if they don't wear that mask. So that's an example of what we're trying to get away from. But so, like I say, so many people, these values are unconscious. They've been raised with them since they were little kids, and they have no other way to look at it other than saying, well, individual freedom is the greatest thing that we have to fight for. And that's one of the reasons they stormed the Capitol, because they're following those kind of values. And these are some of the people and groups that have influenced my thinking and the thinking of the network that I am, the Symbiosis Network. Murray Bookchin from Vermont came up with the idea of what he calls radical municipalism, dual power. And he influenced this other man, Abdullah Öcalan, who was a leader of the Kurdish struggle. I think a lot of people know about the Kurds. Some of them only know about them because of the women that were fighting ISIS. And but having women struggle, have their own military was something that's very radical in the Middle East, because a lot of the people in the Middle East do not value women's contribution to change. But this revolution very much has women's liberation as a part of its thinking. In the same way with the Zapatistas in Chiapas, Mexico. Has everybody heard of the Zapatistas? If you haven't heard of them, you raise your hand if you haven't heard of them.
Oh, no. I heard.
Okay, well, they're been around for like 20 years now, and they have started a revolution, but it's a revolution for autonomy. They do not want to take over the state. They just want autonomy. And this is the goal of people like Bookchin and Abdullah Öcalan. And Native people, we lived in autonomous communities. We did not have states. Therefore, we did not have prisons or jails. In the same way with the Iroquois people.
Oh, sorry.
And sometimes people confuse communalism with communism. But what it says here is communalism goes beyond communism, because what I found over the years studying communism, which at one point in my life, I was actually following communist values, because I realized that communism shares two sets of values with capitalism, which made me realize that I don't really want to follow that anymore. Number one, they both share hierarchical state structures, kind of top-down organizing institutions like the state. And they both value large-scale industrial development. And they were in a race with each other to develop faster. And on the screen, you see where the capitalism values humans on the top and everything else is below. But in the indigenous way of looking at the life, humans are only a part of the circle of life. We're equal to all the other animals, plants, and we don't dominate them. So this is what I want some of the things to think about is, what do you think are capitalist values and what are indigenous values? And how do your values align with these values? Indigenous values value respect, reciprocity, and responsibility. And Holly helped me develop this next part.
I can talk more if you
Well,
Okay.
we both worked on this. We made some changes. And I made a, what would you call it when you put things side by side?
It's like a comparison and
Yeah. Well, anyway, I put them next to each other, and they're almost all of them are the opposite of each other. For instance, Indigenous values are earth-centered. All living things are sacred and need to be nurtured and protected. Water is life. And capitalist values is materialism. The earth is seen as just as real estate, humans as commodities. That's part of our history of this country is slavery treated Black people as commodities who can be bought and sold and exploited. Everything can be bought and sold on the market, including just whatever they want to make money off of, they can figure out a way to buy and sell it, including human beings, which are still being bought mainly as sex slaves through the sex industry. And when we look at people, Indigenous values, women are respected and honored, and women can become leaders just like men. And two-spirits or gay people are also respected. In the capitalist system, which is dominated by patriarchy, women are generally subordinate to men. Most Western religions have male priests, and men control the use of women and girls. So that's patriarchy. And one of the primary values of Native people is reciprocity. In other words, an equal relationship in all levels. Indigenous, generosity, sharing, gift giving. If you take, you must give back in some form, not just in things, but also energy. Like if you take from the land, you need to give something back to the land. You don't just take and just not give anything back except trash or toxic waste. You have to give back to the land in the form of taking care of it, respecting it. So that means that takes energy to do that, to give back to the land, because the land, as Indigenous people, is our mother that gives to us, and we have to give back to the land. And eventually we give our bodies back, and which can be used by the plants for them to grow. Capitalist values are mainly greed, hoarding, and profit. And they get this through exploitation of people, the earth, and all living beings. And they do that many times, taking much more than they need. And we see that in the industrialized factory farming, which uses poisonous things like pesticides, herbicides, and antibiotics, and creates food, processed food that contributes to our obesity, our diabetes, our cancer. All of these come from industrial farming and the toxic ingredients that they put in using when they grow crops. Responsibility. Among Indigenous people, we are responsible to our community. So we have to work together for the good of all. Capitalism is competition and individualism, dog eat dog. And of course, we see that individualism constantly when people who don't wear their mask, because they don't think about that they have a responsibility to the people around them. They don't think they're part of the community, they're just individuals. So they value their so-called individual freedom, which means they can do things like that without being concerned that what kind of harm could come from it to other people. Communalism comes from the commons. And when people came here from Europe to North America, they saw that the commons belonged to everybody. The land and water and the soil were shared equally by everyone. None of this could be bought and sold. So Native people did not have a conception of buying and selling the land or the water or the air. They would say things like, I can't sell my mother. And the colonists, they brought over the idea of private property, which owners can mark off the land and exploit it for private gain and defend it with violence. And think of it as private property in the sense that they don't have to think about common ownership or with a common, what they do to their land has effects on all the other parts of the land. So they feel like they can exploit the land that they own without worrying about the toxic waste that's generated. And they leave that to either the government or individuals to kind of clean up. That's a typical way of private property. And responsibility. Native people, we had a different way of dealing with wrongdoing in our communities. It's known as restorative justice, and it doesn't depend on jails and prisons because we didn't have a state that would create such things. And under restorative justice, community brings wrongdoers and victims together to work out responsibility, restitution, and social harmony. That's how they dealt with people who were hurting other people. They didn't use the kind of retributive justice under capitalism, which leads to mass incarceration in private prisons, and it's based on revenge, punishment, isolation, and it's epitomized by things like the war on drugs and the militarized police forces, which are all controlled by the state, whereas restorative justice is supposed to be controlled by the communities. So there's a real difference, a very definite difference between the two sets of justice. And one of the things that I didn't mention about retributive justice is where it comes from. It comes from, to a large extent, the concept of revenge comes from an eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth, which comes out of Christianity, but also other Middle Eastern religions like Islam and Judaism. So that's what's behind retributive justice to a large extent, is those old values coming from Middle Eastern countries way back. And since we didn't have those, we didn't live in the Middle East and we didn't live in that kind of system, we developed a restorative justice system that was very different. Okay. And governments. Indigenous people, our governance was horizontal direct democracy through councils, now known as people's assemblies, and we governed through consensus. We didn't vote. We just had to get everyone to agree, even if it took a long time. In capitalism, it has a hierarchical top-down authoritarian type of governing system, which is known as representative democracy. And also we use things like the electoral college, which a minority can rule, and that's what we're living under right now under Trump. Then there's a balance between male and female leaders in indigenous governance. And we see that in groups like the Zapatistas in Mexico and the Kurds in Rojava in Syria. They made a part of their revolution. One of the three main pillars of their revolution is women's liberation, whereas women have an equal right to be part of the ruling system. If there is someone elected to an office, there has to be a man and a woman together, not just one or the other. And in the capitalist system, which is very patriarchal, it's mostly men who are leaders, as we've seen, like even among Trump, the vast majority of his people were men. And that's true of most patriarchal governments around the world. And the result is, among indigenous people, we would have confederations, what we would call democratic confederalism. lost my page here. So there it is. Like among Native people, the best example of that was the Iroquois Confederation, which is an example of democratic confederalism. It confederated different tribes together, but they didn't have a state over them. Whereas under the capitalist system, there's always a state which serves their elites, the ruling elites, which are usually men, wealthy men, and property owners. And that has been true ever since the founding of the United States. The only people who could vote were men with property, and men who were white. Women couldn't vote, slaves couldn't vote, and that to a large extent, that's the kind of governing system we have up until the present. So the result is plutocracies. Plutocracies mean ruled by the rich. You got the most money, you can have the most influence. And eventually, some of these devolve into dictatorships. An example would be like in China. Even though China is considered a communist country, supposedly you're not supposed to have billionaires in a communist country, but they do. So they're no longer communists. They're what people call, there's a word for it. I can't remember it right away. But they're very centralized, hierarchical, and sometimes they have empires like the British Empire. And the United States has an empire too, of places like Puerto Rico, Hawaii. Most of the countries in South America at one time were part of the American Empire, and also the Philippines. So if you have an indigenous way of governing, those things wouldn't happen. We would not have that kind of governance. So these values answer Martin Luther King's call for a radical revolution of values. We must replace the cancerous, unsustainable values of capitalism. And the way we do that is we have to start decolonizing our thinking urgently as we face a rising fascist white supremacist movement, which we saw bursting out in the Capitol on July 6th. That was white supremacist and that was fascist. And there were thousands of people who were there. And there were millions who voted for Donald Trump, 74 million people. And he represents all of those values. So that's something that we're going to be facing, is rising fascism, rising white supremacist militias. And they're going to start a campaign of assassinations, bombings, guerrilla warfare, and they're going to try to overthrow the government. But one of the bad things about that is that they're going to target people of color, especially people in the Black Lives Matter movement, but also other people of color, immigrants especially from South and Central America. And even our people have been targeted. Like when we tried to protect our water in Standing Rock, they had a militarized police force attack us viciously. And luckily, Biden is elected, so he's going to stop that pipeline. But they were very vicious when they tried to keep us from, protesting against that pipeline. So I guess the reason that I'm trying to do this and trying to develop this is because I see, like Martin Luther King said, that we need to change our values, but we cannot change our values unless we are aware of what they are, what the values we already have in our heads, even if they're unconscious. And many times, especially among people who supported Trump, the values that are in their head and what they operate on are capitalist values, starting with individualism. So it's a huge task, but I saw it as my job as an activist to begin the process of getting people to see that they have a choice. They don't have to stay with capitalist values, but there's another set of values that are better, more sustainable, and would create a better society than the current values that we're living under. So I guess we're almost at the end of this, right?
Yeah, I think it's 6:40.
Okay. Yeah, can you see what the next slide is? The future goals of what we're trying to do is we want to turn this into a day-long or weekend workshop so that we can give people a chance to talk among certain in their own groups about their own values that they have and that they're recognizing in themselves and how they can change those values. We don't have time to do that in this short presentation, but that's our future goal. So I'd like to end by having people talk about or ask questions about or tell about what values that you practice, whether they're indigenous, and if you still have capitalist values in your thinking, even though you may not be that conscious of them, and how do you feel about your values being challenged? So we can start with the question part now.
Great. I'm going to try to make the screen large so everybody can see one another. Let's see if we can do that. Yay, look.
Do you want me to stop sharing or have some of the slides to reference?
It's up to you all. I would like to just see if there's any questions that we could start off with. Would anybody like to make the question, offer a question? I'd really like to, oh, go ahead.
Or a statement.
Thank you. Ruben, would you like to say something?
Yeah. First of all, thank you for organizing this presentation, for inviting me, and also for all the wonderful information that you just presented, Mr. Mendoza. And I have a question regarding the systems of government. I'm part of a different organization that is being restructured at the moment as we speak. We're beginning to move away from, what most people call the Western model, where you have an executive director and so on and so forth. You have the hierarchy with someone at the top, and then you have different levels coming down. And so we're trying to restructure it in a more indigenous manner. And the question came up in terms of where are the sources that we need to be able to do this. For example, you mentioned this idea of horizontal organization, and that's one of the ways that many indigenous societies were organized. And I agree, but you also have the fact that there were other indigenous people who didn't organize that way. So when we talk about organizing in an indigenous way, how do we differentiate which organization, which type of indigenous governmental organization we're going to use? And what are some sources that you can suggest for us to begin to move in that direction? Thank you.
Yes. There is actually an international group that we're a part of, NOAA and we're part of the Symbiosis Network. And that'd be a good place to get some of those ideas from. If you go to symbiosis-revolution.org, that's the international network that we're part of. And it's very much of a horizontal style of network, that there is no headquarters, there are no elected leaders, there's no executive directors, and what you just mentioned, everybody has an equal voice. And we come together every 2 years in a Congress. And Noah and I were at the last Congress in 2019, where we practice trying to do consensus. In other words, we get moved away from Robert's Rules of Order to consensus, which meant that everybody has to really get together before we can make decisions, which means that if people don't like what is being done, they need to speak up and say, we don't like that idea. And then we need to figure out a way to get them to agree either to stand by or to offer a better way of doing things. So that's the essence of horizontal leadership and organizing on a non-hierarchical way. Like I say, check out the group. Maybe you can type it in on the chat, Symbiosis revolution.org where people can look that up. Because that's the organization that Noah and Annette and myself and Holly are a part of. That a lot of the ideas that I have are similar to their ideas. In fact, they adopted some of these ideas that I had put out into their points of unity.
What was it? Symbiosis dash.
Revolution.org.
This is just to Annette. I don't know why. It won't let me do it to everyone.
Thank you. Thank you for that.
Okay.
Thank you.
Any other questions? Or do you have more questions on that?
Donna, can you unmute?
Hello, thank you for doing this. This is wonderful. It reminds me of my days at the United Nations with the NGO. It was the Congo to the NGO on the, it was first the Day of the World's Indigenous Peoples, then it was the Decade of the World's Indigenous Peoples, and now it's just become more. I mean, so that I remember meeting, you know, fellow Indigenous peoples from North, Central, South America, but also the Caribbean and all over the world, because there's Indigenous throughout the world. So what is, like, I know it's still going on, there's still conferences, and I think there's meetings virtually that have been going on. So do you have any communication with those groups? Or, I mean, yeah, I just wanted to figure that out.
Yeah, well, we are an international network. We have groups in Montreal and other parts of Canada. We had a group that came up from Chiron in Mexico, which practiced autonomous ways of governing. They kicked out all the mayor, the police chief, and all of the state representatives and created a representative, a governing system that was very indigenous, where everybody had a right to speak. And it worked well. And I didn't get a chance to talk, but I want to say that, following what you just said, that there are indigenous people all over the world who have similar values. Values of indigenous people around the world are fairly similar in the sense that most of them are earth-centered, and most of them are direct democracy. Like the Berbers, that were indigenous to North Africa, they were practiced those styles of living. But everybody, every race, even Europeans who are known for being colonists, at one time before the Roman Empire and Christianity came and took over countries in Europe, they were indigenous and they were pagans, and they had the same kind of earth-centered way of living that was sustainable. Probably 95% of human history, people live that way. It's very recently in our human history that we became feudalists or capitalists or communists, you know, and had all these hierarchical ways of governing. But we're trying to spread these ideas because we realize that every race and ethnicity in the country, in the world, at one time had these basic values, and they can reclaim them. And if you're those of you who are European descendants, there's a woman called Starhawk who writes about the pagan way of people in Europe before they were colonized by the Romans, and before the witch burnings. And she makes it clear that the witch burnings, which happened also in the United States, in Salem, Massachusetts, and other places, they were a way of the ruling elites to stamp out pagan ideas, because the carriers of those ideas and values were the women, who were healers and who passed on the culture and the values from that period. And the men wanted to take over, so they set up a campaign of killing those women specifically to take over their role. Like before that, the women were the healers, but the men wanted to become doctors to replace them. And that's what caused the witch burnings.
I have one more question.
Yes.
How do we unite our brothers and sisters like in North, Central, and South America? Because when you think of the conquered mentality, we both speak conquered languages because North America, for the most part, was English, except for, yeah, you know, like Canada has French, and then Mexico's got Spanish, and then Central and South America have Spanish and Portuguese. How do we, and the Caribbean's got French too. How do we unite our people, our indigenous people in the Americas? You know, you talk about the eagle and the condor. My people are South America. I'm Inca. My ancestors are legitimately from the line of the Incas. So, you know, on my parents' side, their first language is Quechua. You know, I was born here. And so, you know, unfortunately, you know, my mom only spoke to me in English, and then I kind of learned Spanish by osmosis, and then Quechua very little bit. But how do we try to unite our peoples? Because still there's the disconnect between, you know, North and South, because, you know, North speaks English and the South speaks Spanish, and then the way we were conquered is different. In the North, it was the reservation system, but south of the border, the Spaniards didn't do that, you know, so everyone just kind of just kept on going. So yeah, I just want to see more of a united front, more of a family saying, you know, Spanish is because they conquered our people there, but we are indigenous too. You know, we have our languages, we have, you know, our customs, and we are related. You know, the eagle and condor, the prophecy has been fulfilled. So how do we continue growing that and nurturing that?
Well, I've written about those ideas in I have a Medium page, well, not a page, but I write for this group, for this web page called medium.com. If you go to medium.com and you look for Roberto Mendoza, you'll see my writing. And one of them, I talk about just what you're saying about the eagle and the condor, about how we all need to become indigenous, get back to our indigenous identity, because so many of people, especially in South America, well, but here too, so many indigenous people no longer know their culture, their history, and their tribe, for that matter. And you know, I remember seeing this YouTube video of a guy who was going around asking people, "What race are you?" And he would ask these Mexican people in the street, and they would say, "Oh, Spanish," and or Hispanic, and he would say, "Well, that's not a race." Then they would say, "Oh, well, we're white," even though they're just as brown as I was. And that's assimilation. And that's what you got to get beyond, is that assimilation complex. Like my own dad, he's from Mexico, his people are from Mexico, on his driver's license, it said white. And he was so proud of that, even though he's just like same color as I am. And that's the assimilation process that has happened to not only your people, but ours too. But luckily, we in North America, it was a little easier to hang on to our cultures and also to our values. Whereas in South America and Central America, there was such savage repression and genocide of Native people that many Native people became ashamed of being Native. And in order to stay alive in those times, they had to become something else. They had to adopt Christianity, they had to adopt Spanish names, they had to adopt their values. And unfortunately, it's the oppression was so great, but it's still possible that people can go back to looking at their values. But I also have to remind people that you have to be careful when you look at values, especially among the Incas and the Aztecs, because the Incas and the Aztecs had evolved into empires who conquered other tribes. You know, so they were on the path of the Europeans in the sense that they were becoming colonists too. So their values were not what we want. They had very top-down value system too, where there was the Inca, there was the Quetzal, whatever his name was, I can't remember, but who was the empire's ruler, and it was a single person.
Right. The last, yeah, it was Huayna Capac, well, Huáscar, and then Huayna Capac, and then Atahualpa. But that's because Atahualpa was the half brother of Huáscar, and then there was, so Atahualpa killed his half brother Huáscar. So then when he met Pizarro, Pizarro met Atahualpa, and that was the last. That was the end of the empire for the Incas. Yeah.
There's another thing that's really positive that came out of the Inca areas, though, is the idea of buen vivir. You familiar with that? Buen vivir, living well instead of living better. I just
heard of it
briefly in my, in a slideshow. But if you could Google that, it's a concept that says we want to get away from living to work. We want to get back to living just to live, not to have to produce for a system. And there is a lot of articles coming out, and the idea is being spread around the world, and it's very similar to what we call communalism. So check that out, because it's really trying to get people to see that there's another way of looking at living on this earth besides the capitalist way. So check that out. And also check out the Zapatistas. They have their way of living is very much what we're trying to go in that direction. And I really like when they talk about their principles that they operate on. So Google them or Wikipedia them, read their articles. There's articles about them that can help you look at how we can get away from this assimilation, this colonization, and decolonize our thinking, because that's the first place that has to be decolonized, is how we think, because we've been so assimilated. I'm no exception. I was raised by my parents were fundamentalist Christians, and I still have relatives who are fundamentalist Christians who probably voted for Trump. So I wasn't born with these values. I had to seek them out. But anyone can do that. Anyone can seek them out. They're out there. Just kind of follow different trails. Look at the Zapatistas, look at Buen Vivir, check out what's happening among the Kurds in Rojava, in northern Syria, because they practice the same set of values, very similar. So they're out there. You just kind of have to go out and search for them and find them. Okay.
I'd like to introduce someone that showed up on the screen, Natalia. This is one of our ambassadors from Spain, right? And she wasn't on earlier. We had acknowledged everyone that's from far away. We're glad to see you. I have a question. If we have several young people who are on the screen right now who have gone through this trauma of the last 4 years, they were raised under Obama, and now they've had a very scary time. And if you were going to advise them on just some simple first steps that they could do as individuals within a community, what would you say to your child or grandchild during these times to help them help us?
Well, unfortunately, my grandchildren are away in the state of Maine, and I only get to see them once a year. But when you're with a child, you can't really tell them about values. You have to show, you have to demonstrate them. Demonstrate your values by living them, by being generous, by being caring. That's how children learn, what is important, not so much what you tell them, because their grasp of the language is not as, not as sophisticated as adults. So they look at you and learn from you by how you are and what you do. So, and if you wanted to follow up more on my thinking, go to medium.com. A lot of my articles are there. Some of them come from a a blog that I used to do. And some of them are talking about South America, indigenous people there, Buen Vivir, Zapatistas, the people in Rojava. That's a good source. I would recommend that because I have quite a few articles, about 10 or 12 articles already there. And then also go to the symbiosis-revolution.com, because that's the network that we are a part of. We in Tulsa and in Plano. And they have a list of books and articles and pamphlets that you can check out too. That's another good source of information. And also you can email me, if you want. Quetzalhambre@gmail.com. And you can get that from Annette, if you can't remember that.
I made a list of links to all of Roberto's writings and some of his video. I don't even know if he has a list of them all because there are so many on the internet. The one thing I think he would be wonderful is at helping as a consultant for any of you that are trying to make change happen through action. I mean, he has been at the forefront of organizing all kinds of groups and organizing events, and probably did so in a very good consensual type of way. So I think it would, rather than that top down, we're going to do it, we'll get it all together. I want to thank you so much for sharing your knowledge with us tonight. And I know Gregory and I had spoken about that we hope that we can do this again and have a workshop that we can talk for more than just an hour. This is absolutely exciting. It's exciting to see all these people on here who are as concerned about our bringing in, a healthy value system into your lives. And so I know that we would like to invite you back for more. We'll have more than this discussion.
Okay, I want to mention that Holly is agreed to help me in this process of developing a day-long workshop. And when the pandemic is over, maybe we'll see both of us traveling around the country giving this presentation in a day-long or even a weekend workshop. So that's something that I think will probably happen.
And I've already promised a meal at my house when we can finally get together. So all of y'all who've been to my house will be back.
Okay.
Yeah, I'd love to hear anybody's feedback about any of these questions of like which capitalist values do you struggle with, and like how do you feel about getting some of these values challenged? Because I feel like that's one of the biggest hurdles is they're such part of their identity. And so I don't know how this feedback would get back, but in making these workshops, if you guys could email Annette or Roberto, I would love to hear back from you guys.
I will get everybody's email that signed up and send out a prompt to you if you'd like to share something back to Holly and Roberto, and let's help them out with this, because I thought it was really a great presentation. All righty. Well, I want to wish everybody a very safe forthcoming week, and let's all pray that tomorrow goes well. Send out good energy. I've already smoked up really good today. Smudged up with Gregory's cedar tonight. That helped a lot too. Wonderful to see everybody's faces, and thank you again. I'm going to close out the Zoom meeting. I will put this in a format where people can get access to it later, and we'll send you the link, okay?
On the chat, I put out my email and phone number.
Excellent, thank you. Did everybody catch that?
And
I will save the chat.
medium.com where you can get to my writings.
Okay. Great. Thank you again, everyone. Appreciate your taking your time tonight. Uncle Greg's waving this way. Bye-bye, everybody.
Bye. Thanks for
Bye-bye
coming.
all. Thank you.
Bye. Thank you.
You're welcome.